An amber glow illuminated the small room, cast by the single oil lamp resting on the table as the final horse-drawn carriage vanished down the road. Still dressed in the blue gown I had spent 3 months hand-stitching, and wearing the traditional prayer covering I had pinned in place before dawn, I stood near the exit while Eli occupied the window seat. He stared down at his own hands, visibly trembling from a nervous energy that mirrored my own. Despite the common perception of traditional husbands as fiercely confident and authoritative figures, he was merely a 25-year-old man locked in an isolated room with an 18-year-old stranger whom he had spoken to only half a dozen times, always under the watchful eyes of our families. We had been brought together by an arrangement between our households rather than any organic romance, lacking any concept of what outside society refers to as a courtship. My mother had summarized the entirety of my marital preparation into 3 brief sentences. 2 weeks prior, my aunt had strictly instructed me to remain submissive and withhold my tears, and an elder from the congregation had offered only the vague assurance that the transition would grow easier with time. Yet, none of them had provided a guide for handling the profound quiet that settled over us once the doorway closed. Eli finally raised his eyes, shifting his gaze from his hands to look directly at me with absolute transparency, confronting the reality of the lifetime commitment we had just inherited. He then uttered exactly 4 words. Those words were completely devoid of malice, nor were they an attempt to assert dominance, frighten me, or display a false sense of romantic grandeur. They came from a man who was just as unequipped for the gravity of the moment as I was, a young man who had simply been handed a rigid blueprint of familial obligations alongside a spouse he did not know. He was merely navigating an overwhelming milestone using the minimal tools he possessed, yet the sheer transparency of his statement introduced a profound layer of complexity into our new life. I had been raised in a culture where unyielding obedience and the public appearance of a harmonious, orderly household were prioritized far above genuine emotional transparency between spouses. On our very first night together, without any conscious intention or understanding of the boundary he was crossing, Eli had stepped completely past those societal expectations. Throughout the initial year of our partnership, it became undeniably clear that Eli possessed a fundamentally decent nature. He was never unfeeling, malicious, or the sort of partner whose memory brings bitterness to a woman's heart in her later years. Instead, he was defined by a profound limitation, one imposed by the rigid lessons he had been taught, the narrow examples he had witnessed, and a social structure that bestowed absolute domestic authority upon men without teaching them how to emotionally connect with their partners. He labored tirelessly, maintained absolute integrity in his business transactions, earned the deep respect of the district, repaired equipment when it failed, and stood ready to assist any neighbor in need. By every metric our society utilized to gauge a successful husband, Eli fulfilled his role perfectly. Yet a quiet isolation often thrives within a relationship built with an emotionally restricted companion. This specific type of isolation is uniquely painful because it offers no overt grievances to point toward. There are no cruel actions to cite or harsh arguments to recount. It manifests as a subtle, pervasive reality that sounds insignificant only to those who have never endured it. The experience of being entirely unseen. I was never disregarded, mistreated, or brushed aside by my husband, yet my inner self remained invisible to him. He was completely present in every functional capability, consuming the meals I prepared, sharing the bed I maintained, and trusting me with the resources generated by our farm. He spoke to his family daily, but he remained completely oblivious to my internal anxieties, the thoughts running through my mind, the literature I turned to when the house was asleep, or the complex theological questions I harbored during Sunday services. Eli never discovered these facets of my mind because he never inquired, having never been socialized to believe that a wife's inner world was something a husband should explore with curiosity. This emotional distance was by no means unique to my own household, as many women of my generation experienced a very similar form of invisibility. The issue stemmed not from an individual character flaw in Eli, but from the foundational blueprint of gender roles during that era, which conditioned women to be endlessly industrious while training men to be unyieldingly self-sufficient. Within that vast space between domestic utility and practical capability, the vital question of whether two individuals truly understood each other's deepest vulnerabilities was simply ignored. Over the initial 5 years of our marriage, I navigated 3 successive pregnancies and home deliveries without the modern support systems or preparation common outside our world, immediately layering the demands of newborn care onto the unrelenting chores of a farm household. I was not explicitly miserable during this period, largely because misery requires a measure of idle time to settle into the consciousness, and my days were entirely consumed by labor. A rare moment of profound clarity arrived on a Tuesday afternoon during our 3rd year of marriage, when all 3 young children simultaneously fell asleep. The residence assumed a rare, absolute stillness as the late afternoon sun cast long, low beams across the kitchen, bathing the room in a rich, golden hue. I sat down at the wooden table, rested my empty hands in my lap, and simply existed in the quiet space without offering prayers, organizing chores, or reviewing the tasks ahead. In that stillness, listening to the rhythm of my own breathing, I realized that I could not identify my own desires simply because no one had ever invited me to articulate them. When Eli entered from the barn 20 minutes later, his face registered a mild, uncritical bewilderment at the sight of his wife sitting completely idle without a visible chore in front of her. Though he inquired if I was well and accepted my response that I was merely reflecting, he went back to his outdoor work without asking what occupied my mind, as he never did. When a woman remains invisible for a prolonged period, a quiet transformation occurs, arriving as subtly as a creeping fog that gradually obscures the edges of her identity until she can no longer recognize her own shape. This realization hit me at the age of 29, after 11 years of marriage and the arrival of 5 children, while managing a household, a farm, and a life that appeared entirely complete to the outside world. Looking into the small mirror mounted above the washing area one morning, a practice we were discouraged from indulging in, I caught an unfamiliar expression in my own eyes. The gaze looking back at me was not filled with sorrow, but was entirely vacant, resembling an oil lamp turned down so imperceptibly over time that the occupants fail to notice the growing darkness until they desperately require the light. This specific state of being is entirely distinct from the natural exhaustion of labor or the physical progression of age. It represents the psychological erasure that occurs when an intelligent, deeply reflective, and curious individual spends years without having any of those internal qualities validated or mirrored by their environment. When the surrounding social structure responds exclusively to your domestic utility rather than your individual humanity, the habit of internal reflection eventually ceases to reach the surface. Eli never actively suppressed my voice or penalized me for harboring independent thoughts. He simply never reached out to discover them or created an environment where they could safely emerge. A breakthrough occurred through Sister Clara, a widow in her 60s who possessed a reputation within our district for enduring profound life challenges without succumbing to cynicism, a trait considered an exceptional virtue among our people. I had always approached her with a degree of trepidation, sensing an intense internal clarity within her that I did not yet fully comprehend. She arrived to assist me for 3 days following the delivery of my youngest child, and on her final afternoon, while the infants slept and Eli labored in the distant fields, she sat across from me at the kitchen table. After studying my countenance for a long moment, she observed that I had gone somewhere far inward, noting that retreating too deeply into oneself constitutes its own distinct form of departure. I sat there at 31 years old, a mother and a wife, completely frozen by the truth of her words. If this account has touched something within you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, or offer your own reflections below. Let us maintain this space as a sanctuary where individual truths can be spoken openly and understood without judgment. Keep exploring your own choices thoughtfully, for your inner truth has always belonged entirely to you.